So good afternoon, Mr. Ambassador. It's a great pleasure to have you with us in this conference. I believe that this is one of your first public appearances. It's about time.
Yes, it is.
So we are glad you're here. So let me start by expressing our deep gratitude to the U.S. for the amazing assistance that the U.S. has given to us from the very beginning, from actually the outburst of the war, and in fact to President Biden himself, I mean, for his warm and rock-solid support to Israel. Mr. Ambassador, it seems that unfortunately we have reached an impasse on the negotiations towards a hostage deal. Can you give them some hope, some update on that?
First, it's a pleasure to be with you here today, and thanks for the work that you do here at INSS. I think if you look at the hostage negotiations, I think it's a mistake to think they're over. There are still conversations going on. They're still back and forth. The differences are being narrowed. It's not yet an agreement. Everyone's looking towards Ramadan, which is coming close. I can't tell you that it will be successful, but it is not yet the case that it's broken down. And I think we have to remember why it's so urgent. First, these are lives. These people's lives matter, and if that was it, we should do everything we can to get them home. But it's also a hugely important strategic issue. I've only been here for 4 months, but I feel pretty comfortable saying that it's going to be hard for the healing in this country to begin as long as the hostage crisis is still ongoing. If you look around at the geopolitical issues, all of which are bubbling at the same time, the combination of an agreement on the release of hostages with a temporary ceasefire and a period where humanitarian relief can flood in to Gaza opens the door to things starting to settle into place on a host of important issues, which I suspect we're going to talk more about over the coming few minutes. A pause would increase the likelihood of a diplomatic solution in the north. A pause would increase the likelihood of the Saudi normalization going forward. And there's a huge need to be thinking about what comes next, which is very hard to do while there's the level of kinetic activity that's still going on. So I think at every level, the hostage crisis is one that has to be brought to conclusion. And I'll finish this by where I started, the people. Every day, it's more and more challenging to be optimistic. We have to get something done.
Absolutely. I'm glad that you're saying that. I mean, the problem is that we don't see how. I mean, we don't see what sort of levers we have or the U.S. has vis-a-vis Qatar or Egypt to make it happen.
So I think that there is a lot of pressure being brought to bear on all of the parties in the negotiations to stay at it. I know that from the top of our government, the president is committed to this and is involved in pressing leaders of other countries to stay engaged and not to let it become a failure and to find room to move. Our negotiator, Bill Burns, is an indomitable person. His heart and soul are in this, and we're doing everything you can to keep a conversation going. Can I guarantee success? No, but I think it's a mistake to assume failure. And while the goal of having an agreement by Ramadan is very important, I think getting it done when it gets done is what we have to focus on.
Sure. Let's talk about the so-called day after in Gaza, sort of a very elusive issue that has been quite controversial here in Israel. Do you think there is a real chance of a revitalized Palestinian Authority taking charge in Gaza in the foreseeable future? How to bring that about if that's kind of the option that is on the table?
I think you have to break it into two pieces. There's going to have to be a workforce to restore civil order in Gaza when the war is over. Somebody's going to have to turn on the lights. Somebody's going to have to make the water run. Somebody's going to have to deal with the waste disposal. Somebody's going to have to start having places for people to live. The workforce, and somebody's going to have to provide security. The workforce is going to have to come from the people who are from the area, many of whom have worked for the Palestinian Authority. It's going to have to be a vetted group of people because there's going to have to be an understanding that Hamas is not taking charge. The question of who's going to be doing the work in Gaza seems to me to be at the heart of any plan for the future. There are a lot of diplomatic solutions to having a way forward that's acceptable in Jerusalem and Ramallah and in the region. I think I'm a practical, operational person. If you could tell me the answer to how you have security on the streets, I think you could solve the other problems. That's where I would begin, by asking the question, how do you have basic security? We saw last Thursday the risk of what happens when there is not security. A convoy is mobbed by hungry, scared people, and it turns into a terrible tragedy. And the reality is restoring order is job number one. And I think going back to the people doing it is a way to think about it.
Sure. You suggested the response to the first question that there is this grand strategy that the U.S. is working on. Can you elaborate on that? And we're talking about normalization with Saudi Arabia. We are talking about a common front vis-a-vis Iran. We're talking about some sort of international cooperation to rebuild Gaza. How do you envision going forward towards the realization of such a grand strategy?
I think it's in some ways easier to think about everything coming together than any one piece coming together. Starting with the hostage issue. If that is not resolved, I don't know how to put the other pieces in a place where I can get them resolved. If you have a quiet for a period of time, I think there's every reason to believe that our diplomatic approach in the North can succeed. Doesn't mean it will succeed. I mean, what's happening on the ground is starting to put things in a place where what has to be accomplished diplomatically is smaller than it was at the beginning. You have two governing bodies that don't seem to want to go to war with each other right now. That's going to require some more diplomacy. But if there's a period of time when you can take stock, I think it's achievable. Normalization, before October 7th, normalization was profoundly in the interests of both Israel and Saudi Arabia. I think it's profoundly in the interests of Saudi Arabia and Israel today. The environment has gotten more complicated, but there's no less reason for it to be the goal. I think it always involved dealing in some way with the question of the Palestinians. I think there was some notion that it didn't really matter if you addressed the issue. I always thought there was going to have to be a component that addressed the future of the Palestinian people. It's very hard right now. I know going out into the streets of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and talking about a over-the-horizon plan for two states, people look at me as if, do you know what's going on? It's a question of what is the alternative? What is the alternative? If there's not a future for the Jewish people, the state of Israel to live in peace and security, and for the Palestinian people to have a future of dignity and hope, this cycle will just keep going on. I think that the question of engaging in finding that solution, if you accept the premise that it has to be a demilitarized state, if you accept that Israel has a right to defend itself, the differences can be bridged. And the question of how can you have the conversation now, I would ask, how can you not have the conversation now? Because if you want normalization to happen, you have to at least be willing to have the conversation. And I think if you look at the array of issues, we have to try to solve all of them. And I don't consider that a grand strategy of a dreamer. Each one is a piece of a puzzle that has to be put together.
Absolutely. I mean, that fits well with the overall theme of this conference, I think, which is that Israel is facing stark choices, dichotomous choices, and this is the time to choose, and you are suggesting that. Mr. Ambassador, unfortunately, we are running out of time, and there's so much to talk about. But, you know, we have gone through, since October 7th, through a terrible national trauma, both individually and collectively. And, you know, Israeli civil society has displayed enormous strength and resilience in coping with it. But nevertheless, we need reassurance, we need hope. You are a friend of the US, of us as a people. Can you offer some words of hope and reassurance?
Well, I have to say that coming here at such a dark time as I did, I was struck at how many things there were to make you hopeful. The way people came together, the way the issues that were tearing the country apart were set aside, the way people just ran to do what they could do to help people they didn't know, who were just, you know, fellow citizens. There was a strength that came out of that. And figuring out how to hold on to that and going forward is ultimately the strength of any country, because none of us, no country is stronger in terms of defending itself from the outside than it would be by strengthening itself from the inside. You have to be strong from the inside. So that's something hopeful. It showed that very different interests could come together. I think that the experience of October 7th is one that is, I say this to people in the United States every day, the rest of the world has started to think of it as something that happened in the past. But here, it's not over. It's a current trauma. And if there's a solution that brings the hostages home, if the war is brought to an end, if going forward, the question is, how do you create a future where Israel is accepted by most of its neighbors, all of its neighbors except for Iran and its proxies? That's a stronger place to be than in a world where Israel's isolated. But I do think Israel has hard choices to make, and the government and the people of Israel have hard choices to make. Coming out of this trauma, coming out of this tragedy, I think it's a burden of leadership to make hard choices, to have a vision to take the country to a stronger place. I do think there are ways to do that.
Mr. Ambassador, I'm very grateful for your words, for your support, for your friendship. This is the beginning of a beautiful friendship, as it says in Casablanca. So we hope to see you again soon at the INSS. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Manu. It's good to be here with you.